AV. Oh. I don't know. No. All right. How's that? Hey. Well, first, many thanks to Tim Wadling for inviting me again to come and talk at this lecture series. Really appreciate it, Tim. I appreciate the continued invitation. And thanks to you guys all for being here tonight and for coming to listen to this talk. And thank you in advance for a little bit of... Oh, yeah.
Just to make you more nervous, right?
Uh-huh.
I think this is an environmental studies class that's here too, I think so.
Oh, great.
Oh,
right on.
A lot more students than we normally have. We're all here to see you.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, thank you guys.
One of my colleagues in the environmental studies program has 17 students here to hear your talk.
Oh, well, thank you guys for coming out as well. I appreciate that.
They're not even in the class. They're just here to hear you. More pressure.
More pressure. And I'm going to thank you guys all for a little bit of forbearance. As Tim said, I've been doing this lecture, some form of this lecture, for a ridiculously long amount of time. But I've switched it up over the years. And this, I think, is like version 4, which is brand new. And I was just finishing it, I should admit, earlier today. And the notes didn't come up on Tim's computer, so I'm going to be flying a little bit blind here. But I think it's all going to hold together. So let's just keep our fingers crossed for that. I know you guys, I look at the syllabus every year, and I know you guys have been talking about a broad range of issues around war and peace and ethics and conflict resolution, war in any number in peace or conflict resolution in any number of kind of fields or coming from all sorts of different angles or perspectives. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different and addressing a war, an ongoing war that much of us, I think it's fair to say, don't think that much about, in part because it's kind of like breathing. And in a way, we are perpetrating this war, we're perpetuating this violence daily, just through, unfortunately, our basic acts of living. And so it's so easy to overlook. And it's also easy to overlook because it's been going on for a very long time. And what I'm talking about is the war of human civilization against wild nature, and the way that we are routinely, and again every day, perpetuating real violence against other living things, other living beings, living systems, ecosystems, landscapes, individual species, individual actually living, breathing things, whether that's a living, breathing tree or plant or a living, breathing critter. I should acknowledge that this war has been going on for a really long time, in fact, for a millennium. It's important to remember that in human history, there was all sorts of amazing creatures that lived on this planet that are no longer with us. This incredible bestiary of large mammals that tens of thousands of years ago were wiped off the face of the earth. This is what's called a giant Irish deer. You can see those massive antlers there, big enough, at least in this artist's conception. And I want to give a shout out to the artist, Peter, and again, I got him in my notes somewhere, first time on this. I think his name is Peter Schutten, who's got a new book called The End of Megafauna. And in his lovely drawings and illustrations, right, of things like a woolly mammoth, or that Irish deer, or a giant ground sloth. Right? If you've ever looked at an avocado pit and sort of wondered how or why would you have a seed that big, chances are that that avocado, that pit, co-evolved to move through the digestive tract of something this big, right? Something that was basically the size of an elephant, or a little bit smaller than an elephant, moving around much of the Americas, right? And then, in an event that's called the Coronary Extinction, all of these animals disappeared, really in the space of just a couple of thousand years. And they disappeared, combination of factors most biologists and paleoecologists think. One was a changing climate, the end of the last ice age, and the other was small bands of hominids, relatively smart, relatively sophisticated with tools, even when they were just spears, very good at cooperation, who were able to wipe out all of these amazing animals, again, in the space of just a couple of thousand years. Now, some of that science is contested. It's a little unclear, what came first, right? Was it the climatic changes that pushed these large mammals over the edge? Was it a combination of these suddenly gifted primates that showed up and started to slaughter them, or a combination of these things? But it's just one small example of showing how, really from the dawn of our species, from the dawn of Homo sapiens, we've been transforming the Earth, and often in very violent ways that have led to the extinction, the disappearance of other critters. But the important thing right now in 2018 is that this long process, right, that's been going on in some ways for thousands of years, certainly since the Neolithic Revolution, some 10,000 years ago, maybe a little bit shy of that, when humans started to domesticate grains and started to domesticate animals, it's been speeding up. And it's gotten much faster, really, in just the past couple hundred years, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and what some people call the Great Acceleration. Right? As our numbers have dramatically increased, as our technologies have gotten so much more powerful, we've spread across the entire world. This is a beautiful NASA satellite composite photo in which you can really see where the people are, mostly because of our lights. Now, there are, of course, other large pockets of people who don't have the privilege, the ability to turn on light, many of those in sub-Saharan Africa, some of those in parts of greater Amazonia, other parts of the world. But in general, you look where those lights are, and that's where the people are. Some 7 billion of us, now moving quicker than ever. And those earlier extinctions now have happened so much more quickly. And it's not just the extinctions, but it's the overall diminishment. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull up a couple of slides that I'll share with next year's class. But some of the woodcuts, right, from just a couple of hundred years ago, when European explorers and others, of course, indigenous people, reported, right? I mean, the most famous examples are like the herds of bison that used to cover the plains of North America. But also, mariners reporting miles, hundreds of miles long, groups of sea turtles, leatherback turtles or green turtles in the Atlantic Ocean. Salmon so thick that some of the European explorers were worried that they would actually swamp their boats because those salmon were kicking up so much water, it was pushing water into their canoes. All of these things that even without there being a numerical extinction, those things are essentially what biologists would call functionally extinct, right? Bison aren't really playing a ecological role on the plains of North America today. Whales that used to, again, mariners would see hundreds, thousands of them, aren't really playing much of an ecological role anymore because of our incredible technologies. This is a map here that's showing the basically footprint of human impacts around the world. As much as 80% of the biosphere is now influenced to some extent or another by human activities. And you can see this on this map here, right, with the bright orange colors. The red and orange colors are showing higher intensity of impacts. The greens are showing moderate impacts. That's probably agriculture. And the blue is showing relatively no impacts. That's really only limited to a couple of places, right? Greater Amazonia, the Saharan Desert, the central deserts of Australia, and then those vast boreal regions in Eurasia and North America where there aren't that many people. But 80% of the biosphere now impacted by humans. According to a World Wildlife Study that just came out last month, the World Wildlife Foundation's annual, World Wildlife Fund, annual State of the Life report, in just the last 50 years, since 1970, so younger than Tim is, in just the last 50 years, human activities have wiped out roughly 60% of wild animal life on the planet, right? So it's like that, again, like going from those earlier human impacts on the biosphere, and now it's happening so much faster. It's not happening over the course of thousands of years when it was just some of us with spears and perhaps atlatls or bows and arrows. Now it's happening in the space of 50 years, right? Basically wild nature being diminished by half. That study, and this study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. This is the stat that got a lot of people's heads turning, was that if you look at all the mammalian mass on the planet, only 4% of it's wild animals. Most of it's us and our domesticated livestock, right? cattle, hogs, etc., goats. That's what's making up most of the mammalian life on the planet right now. So again, yes, are there still tigers? Sure, there are still tigers, a couple thousands of them, but that's down from an estimated 100,000, a century and a half ago. So yes, in some places, tigers are still performing an ecosystem function out there on the land, but they're essentially functionally extinct in most of their former range. This birds one's really stunning. So birds seem to be the animal kingdom that seems to be surviving this onslaught the best, right? Mostly because they're mobile. But even birds, right? Only 30% of the avian life on the planet is wild. The other 70% is turkeys, geese, ducks, chickens that are domesticated by us, that are essentially serving functions for one special species, or at least we think we're special. This is what you can see if you kind of look at the different animal kingdoms, right? And how much of the overall original, let's call it pre-industrial, pre-14, 1500, the richness, the abundance of life on this planet that's now been impoverished. This is what's left. 83% of wild mammals gone, 80% of marine mammals gone, roughly 50% of plant life in some form diminished. And what you see in general, right, is this vast abundance, again, impoverished. And I would say that when you look at a stat, like there used to be in just the George River watershed of northern Canada, there were a couple hundred years ago, an estimated 1 million caribou there. Now there's 6,000, right? If current trends continue, by the end of this century, we'll wipe out about 80% of coral reefs on this planet. That's not warfare, that's genocide, right? That's ecological genocide. When you go from 1 million animals to 6,000 animals. I don't know any other way to explain that. That's basically, coming in and torching everything. And so you see, and I want to give also props to this photographer, Daniel Beltran, who's a really fantastic photographer. I believe this is in Brazil, right, where you can see the rainforest being converted essentially to a soy plantation. And all those rows there, right, those are the bones of dead trees. Those are the bones of dead trees piled up there to make way for industrial agriculture. So taking this incredible forest and converting it into a monoculture system. This here is a palm plantation in Borneo, right, where we're taking some of the richest, most biodiverse forest, tropical forests on the planet in Borneo, and converting them into palm plantations. To either take that palm oil and put it in our cars, the idea being that the best use of food is to set it on fire, or to take that palm oil, put it in cosmetics, put it in other processed foods, and sell it. And so again, this rich wealth of the planet, what happens to all the orangutans that used to live there? Part of the thing I'm trying to kind of point out here is that climate change, for obvious reasons, takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room these days when we're talking about environmental challenges and environmental solutions. But still, even right now in 2018, probably the largest single source of the diminishment of plant and wildlife diversity and richness is just habitat loss. Habitat loss being a fancy scientific name for basically saying we bulldozed your house, or we set your house on fire, or you don't have a house any longer. So again, the orangutans that used to live there, and the one clip I was trying to find, if you haven't seen it, go Google orangutan fights with a bulldozer. It went briefly viral this fall, and it's this really moving photo, right? Orangutans are probably one of the dominant species that live in Borneo rainforests. Again, who've gone from 100,000 plus, and again, I don't have all my notes here because they were on the display here. Went from 100,000 plus down to now thousands in some areas. And this photo of a logging crew coming in, cutting down these trees, and this orangutan having no idea what to do except for try to actually fight a bulldozer. That's really a wonderful, although sad, tragic little glimpse of actually what's at stake. A lot of this, again, is due to just habitat loss. It's due to deforestation. So in roughly the last 40 years, industrial society, human civilization, has cut down more than 1 billion acres of forest across the world. So that's an area the size of Europe. And a study came out earlier this year looking at that what remains, Man, you guys, I gotta apologize. I thought all these things were gonna come up on the display. What remains essentially at current, I think, I'm trying to remember the stat here. I can't make this thing load. At current rates in 25 years, there'll be little to no global wilderness left. Wilderness essentially meaning a roadless area, right? An area that is not at the whim and the mercy of human demands or human needs or human interests, a land that just kind of gets to persist on its own. And I think the stat was that in the last, it was 10 years alone, I think something, again, I don't want to mess it up. So in the last 10 years alone, some huge amount of wilderness had gotten lost. And the pace is accelerating. So what you see, right, is this is another fantastic photo from, I think this is either Daniel Beltran or Edward Bertinsky, right? On the right side of that frame, what do you see? You see a biodiverse forest. What do you see on the left? You see a monoculture. Okay, so biodiverse forest, in this case, being converted into a eucalyptus plantation. So taking that, yeah, there's trees there. Sure, there's a lot of trees, but it's one kind of tree spread out over the entire landscape. So taking, as I would put it, the vast, wonderful symphony of life and converting it into muzak, right? This kind of bland, insipid tone that's not really going to convey much. It's not going to certainly spark in anybody any awe or excitement. The reason why it's important to keep all this stuff in mind, and it's hard to keep it in mind, right? It's so easy to lose, first of all, feel emotionally swamped, to feel cognitively swamped by these statistics, because they're a total downer, right? I think the other thing why it's very hard to keep these facts and figures in mind and to sort of remain present and attentive and emotionally aware of this ongoing, again, ecocide that's happening is in a way because we're so self-centered, right? We're self-centered as a species, and we sort of feel like it's all about us. That's what our culture teaches. This is a photo of the Hoh rainforest in Washington, in the Olympic Peninsula. And you go to a place like the Hoh rainforest, and I've been there, and you're reminded that, you know, these earlier stats notwithstanding, when you think about the total amount of life on Earth, if you start to include trees and ferns, and especially fungi and microorganisms and bacteria, that the world mostly isn't people, right? It's really hard to remember that when you're cruising down the 101. It's really hard to remember that if you're in downtown San Francisco. But most of the world, even today, isn't people. It's other living things. And we are just one species among all those other living things. And yet, again, this is sort of the cultural representations that we get. These are the spaces that we've built that are totally human-dominated areas. Now, I'm not going to say this is unnatural. In a way, it's natural, right? I mean, first of all, they're showing the Lion King there, and there's a thing that says Circle of Life. And got that groovy, Lion King billboard. Everything there is a natural material, right? That glass had to come out of silica someplace, and get made into glass. The asphalt is a product of the earth. The concrete's a product of the earth. All those clothes are products of the earth. This is a natural environment in its own way. But it's a totally human-dominated environment where there's not really any opportunity for everything else to thrive. Same here, right? This would look like a really kind of bucolic shot. You think, oh, it's lovely. It's a cornfield, right? This is a grain factory. That's a landscape that was turned into, there's only about 2% of the original tallgrass prairie of North America remaining. Right? So you had this vast swath of the continent that was this incredible richness of all kinds of different grasses and flowers and shrubs. There was obviously, millions of bison. There were pronghorn. And now most of it is a grain factory, right? It's basically taking all of that natural abundance and converting it into a single use, a use that's for us, in order, mostly in this case, to make soda, right? To make cola, to make high fructose corn syrup and put it in junk food. So we took all of that natural abundance and converted it into a use that's just for us. And it's hard to keep track of that stuff, again, because we're so self-centered, and in part because of something that's called the shifting baseline syndrome. This is a term coined actually by a fisheries scientist who was trying to, among other work, trying to identify why is it so hard for us to see this ecological diminishment, right? It's like you can read it in a history book, and you'd be like, yeah, God, there used to be millions of bison, and now there's tens of thousands, and many of them are actually beefalo, and the number of kind of purely genetic bison is not that many. But even in our own lifetimes, right, it's hard to kind of go from noticing the creeping erosion of natural wealth. I was even thinking about getting here tonight, and there's this new subdivision they're building on the north side of campus here. And I was remembering, this is a small example, right, but I could still remember when that was like an open field. People got to live somewhere, and luckily those homes are packed pretty densely, so at least they're not taking up that much space. But still, it's hard for us to remember what was lost. And it's because of what's called the shifting baseline syndrome. We sort of remember what's of our own childhood or our own whatever, your own baseline that you can fix. And that's what you lock in your mind as the good or the right or the normal, right? So today's catastrophe is going to be tomorrow's status quo. Like now it seems crazy. Oh my God, the hills burn every year and we're losing homes and we're losing people and we're all sitting in smoke for 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball and it's pretty hazy, but who knows? In 10 years, that's going to be the new normal, right? And so the baseline shifts without us even knowing it. Collectively, we're like on this treadmill of collective amnesia, right? And that it's so hard to remember how things used to be. And again, we acclimate ourselves to the new catastrophe. So here's a photo, and you got to pay attention to that sign back there, right? So this is clearly taken like in the 50s or the 60s. And look at the size of those fish. Same place, the fish got smaller. Now all the humans' smiles are the same size, right? The human smiles are the same. Like these guys are just as psyched whenever this was, 80s or 90s, to have caught a bunch of fish, even though the fish have gotten smaller. So there's a fisheries scientist who was able to see that, oh my God, what used to be cast-off fish because it was so small is now the prized fish because it feels so big. And that shifting baseline syndrome, there's a really great article that appears in last week's New York Times Sunday magazine by Brooke Jarvis, who's got an article there in the current Sierra magazine about the insect apocalypse. I mean, this is another thing that we've lost, according to some studies, up to 75% of insect life in the last 30, 40 years, and nobody noticed. Even the entomologists didn't notice because they actually weren't studying. It's another problem with the shifting baseline. And as Brooke writes, I think really movingly, it's hard to notice that we're in a fallen world because we grow accustomed to the fall. We grow accustomed to thinking, oh, this is as big as the fish have ever been, and that they haven't ever been in the past bigger. And so this shifting baseline syndrome it's really like a huge problem with us trying to wrap our heads around the ecological diminishment of the world. Because again, we kind of grow used to it. We grow used to living in this impoverished place. And yet somehow, against all odds, we have to find a way to not grow accustomed. To say this is not normal, right? This is again from Borneo. Another shot where one of the most biodiverse forests on the planet, one of the richest stores of carbon on the planet, because many of these are peat soils and it's locking and sequestering millennium-old carbon there, that this isn't normal. And in fact, this kind of logging in Borneo wasn't happening 25 years ago. This is a little bit of a new phenomenon. So that's the thing, is how do we not grow accustomed to this destruction, to this loss, to this ongoing war, to this ecological genocide that, yes, as I acknowledged, has been happening for a very long time. And I'll admit, it's really hard. It's really hard to do. And yet, I think the evidence is staring us very clearly in the face and trying to wake us up and say, we have to not grow accustomed. We have to find a new way of doing things. Because again, the evidence is right there. This is a photo from the 2017 Napa Sonoma fires. This is the Coffee Park neighborhood in Santa Rosa, leveled just a year ago. This is Hurricane Harvey barreling its way to the Texas coast, where again it dropped 51 inches of rainfall in like 36 hours. It was a world record as that storm just sort of sat off the coast. Again, flooding out better parts of the third largest city in America and the petrochemical hub of America, showing that Mother Nature's got a little bit of a sense of humor, and real lives being at risk, right? Lives being at stake, right? I don't know what the current number is, but at least I think 66 people died in the Camp Fire last month in Butte County. Obviously, scores of people died in the Napa Sonoma fires here, and people died in Hurricane Harvey. And in what I think is our opportunity now is how do we turn this crisis into an opportunity to sort of wake ourselves up and say, now the baseline is shifting so fast. The great acceleration is moving so rapidly that it's impossible to miss. And that now is our chance to really conceive of a new way, not only of living with each other, but also living with the rest of life on Earth. To kind of thread this back and bring this back to the War and Peace lecture series, yes, there is a war of human civilization against wild nature, and that's been going on a long time, with the exception of some dissenting voices, which I'll get to in a minute. But this steady diminishment of our resources also then exacerbates and fuels other human conflicts on an already unstable planet. So here's a great quote from the former UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon, who's pointing out that if people's resource base, right, resource base is like, right, people's ability to grow their own food, so the ability, the health of their topsoil, clean air, clean water, some sort of green space around them. If they can't depend on that for their own sustenance, then it's going to fuel conflict. It might not be the source of conflict, but it's certainly not going to help. And there's a couple of examples of this just immediately that we can look at, where, in fact, resource depletion or other environmental factors have contributed to war, conflict, and human genocide. The two that are most oftenly pointed to, including in UN reports, would be the Syrian civil war and the genocide in Darfur. And the links are very clear, right? Did ecological stresses alone, did climate change alone spark the Syrian civil war? No. But there was a drought that happened in the Middle East, that happened in Syria in 2014, 2015, that exacerbated social tensions there, led people out into the streets to protest against the Assad regime, and helped contribute to that civil war. Same thing in East Africa, in Sudan. Yes, that is a long-running conflict between Christians and Muslims, and goes back hundreds of years, goes back generations. And yet a long-running drought there, the inability of the land to sustain people with a sustained human population increase, contributed to the conflicts there. Now those are obviously like worst case scenarios, but you can even see it here in the US. This is a photo of the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline just about 2 years ago exactly, where you, again, have a conflict over resources or over the land, right? Multinational energy companies saying, we're going to build a pipeline right through here. And indigenous communities, in this case the Standing Rock Sioux, Native American tribes saying, no, you're not, right? Again, that's basically a resource conflict. Now, it's not sparked by resource scarcity. If anything, it's sparked by resource overabundance, right? The indigenous community saying, we don't want you to put our water at risk. That's the indigenous protesters, they were very clear in saying, we're not protesters, we are water protectors. And again, an example of how, who controls the land, who makes the decisions, who has a seat at the table to make those make those decisions. If it's not an equitable process, if it's not a transparent process, if it's not a democratic process, will lead to conflicts like this one. That's another photo of the Standing Rock Sioux of the Dakota Access Pipeline fights. And then all of this, right, it's not only just a conflict over resources, it's now increasingly a contest over space. The eminent writer and environmental activist Bill McKibben points out in a recent New Yorker essay that the world is actually shrinking. Okay, so the diameter of the world is the same, right? The Earth is not shrinking. But because of climate change, the habitable areas of the world are starting to diminish. And in our lifetime, we're going to really see some habitable areas of the world diminish. I mean, just this past year, we saw highest daytime temperatures ever in Pakistan, highest nighttime temperatures ever in Oman. I mean, a lot of global climate change in some desert regions is not just going to be about the daytime highs, it's about the nighttime highs. It's that it never cools off. Plants, animals, people never get a break from the heat. And if you combine that with really high humidity, it literally becomes impossible to live there. There could be great sections of the globe, parts of the Middle East, parts of South Asia, where people are not going to be able to live, to survive in, I don't know what exactly the year is, but in, call it 30, 50 years. And so that is going to make the world smaller. And those people are going to want to go somewhere. And they've got every right to demand a habitable place to live. And so this is what you see here, right? A boat, this is in the Mediterranean, overflowing with people trying to make their way from Africa or from the Middle East to Europe. We see that here. This is a photo of the migrant caravan. There's a lot of good reporting that's out there that's showing yes, there's any number of reasons why people are leaving their homes in El Salvador and Honduras and trying to come to the United States. Violence, unstable political systems, political repression among them. But it certainly doesn't help that there's less land to cultivate, that shifting weather patterns are making it harder to do subsistence agriculture. We ran a story about this at Sierra Magazine. National Geographic ran a story about this. There is some small measure in which environmental pressures are exacerbating migration, which exacerbates social tensions. Again, I think these folks in this photo have got every right to come here and seek asylum, to find a place for they and their families to live. It's also important to remember that many people would love to stay in the homes where they were born and raised and where their families and communities are, and yet these environmental stressors are giving them one more reason where it's like, where are you going to live? And I think the migration pressures, the migration challenges we're already seeing are only going to become more acute later in this century. So what's the response, right? I mean, this is all a bunch of bad news, and I'm sorry, I'm just giving you about half an hour, it looks like, of bad news. And there's a lot of bad news out there. I mean, I'm not gonna gild it for you. But it's important to remember that there is another way of thinking about this. Another way of thinking about our relations among ourselves. And there's another way of thinking about our relationships with the land, with the rest of life on Earth. And I know that a good deal of this lecture series focuses on that, right? The root causes of war and violence, and how can we get towards conflict resolution? How can we reduce war and violence? I don't have all the answers to that, obviously, but I can suggest at least one answer that gets to how we can reconceive our notions with wild nature. And thank God the environmental studies people are here, because they can tell you all about Aldo Leopold, who wrote in his, oh, and look, I tell it's moving fast, Aldo Leopold there, there's an L there. Aldo Leopold, author of a Sand County Almanac, which is a really seminal, at this point, canonical book in environmental literature, in which basically a forester, a man who spent most of his career working for the U.S. Forest Service, eventually, after spending enough time in wild places, became something of a philosopher and tried to conceive of a new way of thinking about humans' responsibilities to the rest of life on Earth. And he calls it the land ethic. It's pretty simple. He says the land is a community. That land as a community is the basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. And Leopold points out in his book, right, that most of human history has been trying to extend ethics in a broader and broader circle of concern. Right? So initially it's just the tribe or the clan. But then can you expand that out to the nation? Can we then expand our circle of concern, right, just to include people who are born male, to then include women? Can we then extend that circle of concern farther to go from people who don't look like us to, or only people who look like us, to then include people who don't look like us, right? And Leopold kind of goes to this. He looks at the Greeks. He looks at Judeo-Christian ethics. He looks at even Confucian ethics. He says, okay, we've been trying to steadily increase, right, the boundaries of our empathy. But can we even then go a step further into a kind of ecological ethics and start to also extend our compassion and our empathy, not only, again, to people who might not look like us, who might not share the same physical characteristics, but even to other life forms. And he says when we recognize that other things have rights, and it's really important to ask, like, again, who decides who has rights? And in this case, why do we only grant rights to people? Why do we only grant rights to this one species among millions of other species on Earth? He says when you recognize that other beings may have intrinsic rights, then we can make clear judgments about whether our actions towards nature are right or wrong. He's working toward an environmental ethics, right? And he says, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. And he goes on from there to say that, in short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to a plain member and citizen of it. I mean, this is really an ideal of ecological equality or ecological democracy, right? How can we, in some ways, grant as much intrinsic rights and intrinsic values to other living creatures as we grant to ourselves? And he's really careful here in saying the land ethic, right? It's not necessarily saying that every cockroach is going to have the same rights as your son or daughter, but it's saying that the land community as a whole, the landscape as a whole, enjoys equal rights to people. And again, I recognize like, this is a hard thing to wrap your mind around. It's already hard enough for most people to want to grant equal rights, to people who've got a different sexual or gender orientation or a different skin color, much less to grant equal rights to a bunch of trees and rocks and flowers and squirrels. But yet that's somehow what we've got to get. And Leopold, the incredible thing about Leopold is that he wrote this book published while he was still alive, but it sold very poorly for many years and only became a hit really in the 1960s after he had died. In fact, fighting a forest fire on his family's farm in Wisconsin. And yet it's had, and I will recognize this is a dissenting view, but it has had this long tail that's influenced all sorts of people, from Pete Singer, who's the animal rights ethicist, who wrote Animal Liberation and talks about should we in fact grant equal rights to individual animals, to R.A. Nass, the deep ecologist, to people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, an indigenous writer and philosopher. And it's the best ideal I can think of. And it's because it's so plain spoken, right? I mean, I think Leopold is kind of like the Thomas Paine of ecological political science. It's just, he's writing in a plain language and trying to make a big and broad case. And this is what we have to get to. This is the place that we need to get to if we're going to somehow find a way to strike a balance between 7 billion of us and the rest of life on Earth. So that we don't have, and again, this photo from Daniel Beltran, so we don't have this. Because yes, as the clearly most powerful, most technologically advanced, in some ways, minus bacterium and stuff, most new, and mosquitoes or whatnot, smaller life forms, the most numerous species on the planet, certainly the most numerous mammalian species, we can do whatever we want. I mean, we can do that. We can do whatever we want, and we're currently doing whatever we want. But there's no grace in that. There's no honor. Certainly, if you were to act like that as a person, as an individual, you said, I'm going to act however I want without any regard to other people, you'd be called a tyrant. You'd be called a sociopath. I'd be like, wow, how can this person just presume that they're going to come into my house and strip mine it and then take off? And so that really is the challenge before us, is how do we go not just from being a good neighbor with other forms of life, but to being a good roommate, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're all living in this one-room house floating in space. There's no planet B. Do not believe, I guess Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they might shoot themselves to Mars. You think you guys are going to be on the ship? You're not going to be on the ship. You're not going to get 7 million people to Mars. Some people are going to be left behind. So the billionaires want to shoot themselves and go live underground on Mars. That's fine. They can shoot themselves to Mars. The rest of us are going to have to figure out a plan B to survive and thrive on this one planet. And I'd like to think that in a way, not to be reductive, it boils down to just some bumper sticker wisdom. Live simply so that others may simply live. In this case, not only our fellow humans, but other forms of life. So that those other forms of life, the tigers, yes, and the whales, yes, but also the songbirds and the insects and the trees, so that they can live as well. I totally recognize that this is a high bar. It's a high bar to wrap your mind, much less your heart and your emotions, around this idea of an ecological ethics. But in some ways, it's not all that hard, because I think what it requires us doing in our daily lives, our individual lives, and collectively as a society, is substituting quantity for quality, right? Our whole society, our whole economy is based on this idea of GDP, that if we make and build and sell more stuff, the economy grows. But there's no subtraction function in GDP, right? There's only addition. So if a couple gets divorced, and all of a sudden they got to get 2 homes and an extra car and a child psychologist for the kids, that grows GDP. You throw somebody in jail, that grows GDP. Because now you had to build a prison, you had to put somebody behind bars, you had to feed them, you had to hire the prison guard. GDP is like the crudest formula you could possibly have for measuring societal progress. It just says more stuff is good. Even though I think most of us know in our own lives that's not totally true. That in many ways we'd rather have quality over quantity. So how do we make this transition, right? How do we go from this coal-fired power plants that are causing childhood asthma, that are fueling the climate crisis, to this? right? An economy based on clean energy technologies, based on wind, solar, small-scale hydropower, tidal power, geothermal power. How do we go from, again, an economy that's essentially based on digging up the bones of dinosaurs and setting them on fire to something that's about harnessing the wind and the water today? How do we go from all being stuck in our cars in traffic jams, wasting a ton of time, having our cortisol levels, right, our stress totally shoot through the roof because we're in traffic, to saying, you know what, I'd rather ride my bike. I can quit my gym membership because I'll ride my bike and I'll get there faster anyway too. God, I was listening to KQED this morning, and they had this segment, talking about this family in San Jose. I think both the husband and wife work at Google or something. And they said it takes them an hour and a half to drive 14 miles to get to work. I was like, I mean, again, I don't know what the situation is. Maybe they got 2 kids and they got to schlep them to school, but it's like, you do that on a bike in like, you know, well less than 90 minutes, and you're spending an hour and a half in a car every day to go 14 miles. How do we go from this, right? An industrial food system that not only is bad for our bodies, is clearly bad for the planet as well. We can't afford all of these cows on the landscape, and we can't afford, again, those grain factories, to an organic system or some sort of other system that is trying to use agriculture, restorative or regenerative agriculture, like the guy in the video, that is looking at how natural systems work and through the wisdom of biomimicry, copying them. How do we go from this, again, clear-cut in Borneo, and I keep coming to Borneo because it really is just the most maddening situation of a couple of bad human decisions leading to a total ecological and social and human rights catastrophe by making some very short-sighted decisions. How do we go from this clear-cut in Borneo to a polyculture? This is a Sonoma vineyard here. You can see that lovely polyculture in the bottom that, again, is looking at how do we restore, conserve, and protect natural systems. I'd like to think that if we do that, right, we can go from the current war on nature, the millennium-long war on nature, and see that not only in adopting an ecological ethics, we're also finding and discovering an ecological solidarity, right? Solidarity being the idea that I'm going to help you, I'm going to assist you, not because I think that's just good for you, not because it's charity, but because I recognize that my own health, benefit, welfare is tied up in your own health, benefit, and welfare, that our fates are conjoined, right? So that it's not just about saving the planet. It's about recognizing that if we save the planet, we're also going to be protecting ourselves. We're going to be also creating a sort of self-defense for ourselves. That in, again, ending this war on nature, we will also be creating a better life for ourselves and our own families. And that, in the end, is the real kind of ecological solidarity we need to climb out of this hole and make a U-turn. So with that, I'll stop talking at you. Again, sorry I didn't have all my notes together for this inaugural lecture on this topic. Thank you for listening. I guess we got, what, like 10 minutes or so, more? And would love to have a conversation. Questions, comments, disagreements, polemics?